Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of history's absolute most fascinating paradoxes. If you've ever flipped from the end of the Old Testament straight to the beginning of the New Testament, you literally turn one single page. Just one. But what you might not realize is that that paper-thin page represents a staggering 4 centuries of real, gritty human history. We're looking at 400 years where prophecy suddenly and completely ceased. I mean, to the people living through it, it must have felt like an absolute eternity of silence. But as we'll see today, what looks like a blank page in the history books was actually this remarkably active, deeply complex prelude. Okay, let's really get into this immense mystery. Just think about the centuries leading up to this period. The historical narrative of these texts is completely packed with God speaking through roaring prophets, spectacular visions, undeniable miracles. And then, the prophet Malachi delivers God's final recorded message to a super weary nation of Israel. He vanishes from the stage, and then, poof, nothing. Complete radio silence. For 4 entire centuries, heaven seemed to go utterly quiet. No new prophets, no new scripture, no burning bushes, just silence. Can you even imagine the psychological toll that would take? Generations lived and died wondering if they had been completely forgotten, left to ask this one agonizing, burning question. Where was God? Let's take a look at this timeline, because this vast gap is just staggering when you really map it out. On one end, around 400 BCE, you've got Malachi's final message. On the exact opposite end, the eventual arrival of Jesus. 400 years is an incredibly long time. To put that into perspective, that is longer than the United States has even existed as a nation. It's huge. And between these two bookends, empires were rising and falling. While the heavens were supposedly quiet, the earth down below was absolutely anything but. But, and here's the wild part, the source text suggests that behind this apparent silence, an invisible architect was actually hard at work. History was moving, and it was moving fast. The Persian Empire, which had ruled the region for a long time, suddenly falls. Then, this young military genius named Alexander the Great sweeps across the known world literally like wildfire. He redraws the maps, completely changing the political borders. But Alexander brought something way more powerful than just a conquering army. He brought a whole culture. So, why does this matter? Well, this wasn't just some chaotic conquest. Alexander's campaigns were unknowingly preparing a common language. And this is absolutely crucial because, before this, the world was deeply fragmented by hundreds of different local dialects. Alexander unknowingly prepared a single universal language. He probably thought he was just Hellenizing the globe for his own glory, right? But in reality, he was forging the exact linguistic tool that would eventually allow a future message, the gospel, to spread rapidly and seamlessly straight across borders. Now, after Alexander died, things got pretty messy. His vast empire fractured, and rival kingdoms fiercely fought for control. Amidst all this chaos, Jewish communities became increasingly spread out across the Mediterranean. Because Greek was now the language of trade, of law, and just everyday life, a lot of these dispersed Jewish communities were losing their grasp on ancient Hebrew. So they undertook this monumental task, translating their ancient Hebrew scriptures into the new common language, Greek. This huge translation became known as the Septuagint, and it was a real game changer. Suddenly, the sacred texts weren't locked behind a regional language barrier anymore. Literally anyone in the Greek-speaking world could now read the prophecies for themselves. As time ground on, though, this cultural shift turned pretty hostile. Foreign rulers decided they wanted total cultural assimilation, and they attempted to completely erase Jewish worship. They actually desecrated the sacred spaces. Well, this pushed the oppressed people right over the edge, sparking an eruption of fierce rebellion known as the Maccabean Revolt. It's this incredible underdog story. Against absolute, overwhelming odds, no way they should have won, a small group of Jewish fighters miraculously drives out their oppressors and reclaims their temple. It was a massive victory that restored a desperate glimmer of hope to a very weary people right in the middle of this long silence. Okay, so hope was temporarily restored, but that whole struggle, it birthed a highly complex, totally fractured new spiritual landscape. Without a single unifying prophetic voice to guide them, the Jewish people kind of splintered into distinct factions. You've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots.
Each of these groups popped up as a direct reaction to the silence and all that political turmoil. And each group offered a drastically different vision for what Israel's future should look like and how they should live while waiting for God to speak again. I mean, some retreated out to the desert, some compromised with the local politicians, some focused strictly on the law, and others, well, they wanted to literally take up swords.
Now, what's really interesting here is how these centuries of waiting basically created a pressure cooker of deep, desperate anticipation. The people absolutely remembered the ancient promises, but they were completely split on what their ultimate deliverer would actually look like. Some were expecting a conquering military king, a new David to come in and crush their oppressors, maybe inspired by those recent Maccabean victories. But others were awaiting a humble, spiritual prophet to heal their connection with heaven. This intense, totally divided anticipation perfectly set the stage for a dramatic entrance.
And right when this religious fervor reaches its peak, a new superpower steps onto the scene with an absolute iron grip: the Roman Empire. Rome took absolute control of the entire region. But they didn't just bring soldiers, They brought their legendary engineering. They laid down thousands of miles of roads, built massive infrastructure, and established this relentless, sweeping political order known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. So suddenly, the whole known world was highly connected, physically easy to travel, and relatively stable from things like pirates and bandits. Honestly, there is such a profound historical irony to this whole era. Rome, in all its sheer arrogance, believed it was building an eternal kingdom just for its own emperors. They paved those massive roads so their legions could march swiftly and crush rebellions. But actually, think about it like this. What appeared to be terrifying imperial domination was literally laying the physical highway system for a completely different global movement. Roman roads and Roman political order were the exact infrastructure required for the forthcoming message of the gospel to travel farther, faster, and safer than ever before in human history.
And then it happens. Finally, the 4 centuries of hushed, agonizing waiting are shattered. But it doesn't happen in the grand marble palaces of Rome. It doesn't happen in the busy, philosophical courts of Greece. It happens out in a remote, dusty region, with the sudden, shocking appearance of an angel. A divine messenger steps into the world of an ordinary priest, and just like that, the 400-year silence is definitively broken. Once that silence breaks, the pieces just rapidly fall into place. An angel's arrival announces the waiting is over. Then John the Baptist shows up, exactly as the promised forerunner, echoing those ancient prophecies of Malachi that had kicked off the whole silence in the first place. Soon after, Jesus of Nazareth enters history. But look at the world he's stepping into. It's a world with a single common language thanks to Greece, widely available translated scriptures ready to go thanks to the Septuagint, physical paved roads thanks to Rome, and a population vibrating with deep spiritual anticipation. The whole world had been perfectly, flawlessly staged for his message.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we've got to look back over those 400 years and ask ourselves this one powerful question. Was it actually divine silence, or was it divine preparation? The source text leaves us with this profound realization. Those 400 years, they were never wasted time. It wasn't the absence of God at all. Empires rose and fell, languages spread like wildfire, roads were built, and hearts were deeply tested. What looked to the naked eye like an empty, silent page of history was actually the masterful, invisible unfolding of a perfect plan. And it really leaves you wondering, in the quiet moments of our own lives or history, when things seem totally silent, what kind of unseen preparation might actually be taking place right under our noses? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.